this section, we're going to compare cardiac muscle to skeletal muscle. So this graph is your cardiac muscle. This one is skeletal muscle. And we're doing this comparison because you already know about skeletal muscle from chapter 10, and we're going to see how cardiac muscle is similar and how it's different. One thing I want to point out here and make clear is that we are talking about the cardiac muscle cells. This is not the nodes. So we're going to be talking about voltages. And we just finished talking about voltages in nodes. But this is not the same thing. This is different. Remember the sarcolemma? So again, if you have forgotten chapter 10, you have to go back and review that. Sarcolemma is the membrane of a muscle cell. And it has action potential and resting membrane potential just like a neuron. So remember in chapter 10 you learned about the acetylcholine, which is the neurotransmitter that stimulates skeletal muscle, is released from the motor neuron onto the muscle. That causes an action potential in the sarcolemma. The action potential goes down the T-tubule. That's what makes the terminal cisternae open their calcium gates, release the calcium, bind the troponin, make cross bridges contract. Okay, so this has voltages, right? You look here, membrane potential, and here's your voltages. This is not the voltages of the node. This is voltages of the sarcolemma. So we're looking at the voltages that happen in a muscle cell. This whole page of notes is going to be the voltages of the muscle cell. Okay, so let's look at what they have in common. They both start with a resting membrane potential of about -90. So here we'll do what they both have in common. Resting membrane potential of -90 is where you start. Then you have sodium comes in, so you have depolarization, and you raise up to +30. So depolarization is the sodium in, and you raise to +30. Okay, then you have potassium goes out, which is repolarization. This should all sound familiar. You learned this in chapter 12 also. Sodium in, potassium out. Here is your repolarization, the potassium out. And that brings you back down to -90. Okay, notice the green area in each of these. We have this green area here, and here we have this little green area. That is the refractory period. So the green area represents the refractory period. Okay, remember in chapter 12 learning about how the action potential moves along the axon and it has to move forward, it can't move backwards. And the reason it can't move backwards is that the sodium gates become locked. Okay. Refractory period is the time during which you cannot have another action potential. So you can't start another action potential during the refractory period. Because the sodium gates are locked and they don't open back up until you return to your resting membrane potential. So now's where we'll start to see the difference between skeletal and cardiac. Notice in skeletal that refractory period is very short. You have sodium come in, you go up to positive 30, then immediately potassium goes out, you're back down to negative 90, refractory is over. You can see right here, the refractory is ending as soon as you get back to negative 90. In the heart, you have a very long refractory period. Sodium comes in, you depolarize to positive 30. Notice there's this plateau. Then you repolarize back down to negative 90, and then once the voltage, right here, returns to negative 90, notice the refractory ends. So first we'll look at what causes the longer refractory and then why that is important. So remember with the heart, you're also letting that extracellular calcium in. So remember, that's in the muscle. So go back to your last page of notes. Look at the part that says the cardiac muscle cell, the very far right. Remember, extracellular calcium comes in. And that calcium is used to make cross bridges, but it's a positive, it's a cation. So it's also raising the voltage. So in the heart, let's do a color here for when we're talking about just the heart. In the heart only, you have extracellular calcium enters the muscle cell. And we already talked about this extracellular calcium forms cross bridges. And this is what gives you more cross bridges. The more of it you let in, the more cross bridges you get. It also raises voltage because it is a cation that's entering. So in the heart, you have this plateau phase. So right here is the plateau. Notice in the skeletal muscle, the voltage goes up and it immediately drops back down. In the heart, the voltage goes up, then it slowly drops back down. During that plateau, you have calcium coming in and raising your voltage at the same time as you have potassium going out and lowering voltage. So you have one thing raising voltage and another thing lowering voltage at the same time. So they counteract each other. It's like pouring hot water and cold water into a glass at the same time. Well, you're going to end up with warm water. So during this plateau phase, the voltage tends to steady out. You're going to end up with a steady, kind of slowly decreasing voltage. So you have this fairly long period of time between depolarization and repolarization. So in the skeletal muscle, the refractory period is short because sodium comes in, then immediately potassium goes out. You depolarize, you immediately repolarize, you return to negative 90, refractory is over. In the cardiac muscle, you have sodium come in, you depolarize to positive 30, then you have your potassium going out, but you also have calcium coming in at the same time. So here we have calcium in, we have potassium out at the same time, so they cancel each other out. And you get this plateau. You don't immediately drop back down to negative 90. Then when you get to the repolarization, the calcium gates close and you just have potassium going out. And then you drop back down to your negative 90 and refractory is over. So in the heart has a long refractory. Because during plateau, you have calcium in at the same time as potassium out, and they cancel each other out. Then refractory ends when the calcium gates close. So then the calcium gates close and you are left with just potassium going out, and that is when you repolarize. And when you repolarize, refractory ends. Now let's look at the significance of this. Notice we have this red line here that shows muscle contraction. So here is the muscle contracting, right? And then here is the muscle relaxing. Notice in the skeletal muscle, the muscle contraction and relaxation both occur after refractory is over. Let's get a color for skeletal muscle only. In skeletal only, contraction and relaxation are after refractory. Okay, think of a strobe light. It flashes off and on really fast. That's how you stimulate your skeletal muscles. When you say you lift your arm up and you keep your arm lifted for a whole minute, that's not one nerve signal lasting a whole minute. Nerve signals are a fraction of a second. It's like a strobe light going really fast. You're re-stimulating that muscle over and over again very fast. Once the refractory ends, you can have another action potential. Notice here in the skeletal muscle, you can stimulate it again before it has relaxed. So you can re-stimulate before it relaxes. That is how you keep your arm up for a whole minute. You keep re-stimulating it before it has a chance to relax, and so it stays contracted. And this state of staying contracted is called tetany. Not to be confused with the disease tetanus. Remember, we learned about that in chapter 14. That's a bacterial infection. We're not talking about infection. Tetany is just a state of keeping your muscle contracted. You do this all the time. Now look at the heart. Here is relaxation. Notice the muscle is already relaxing within the refractory period. Down here is where you can stimulate it again. And by the time you can stimulate it again, it's already relaxed. So that long refractory period, because of the plateau, means that you can't re-stimulate that muscle before it relaxes. So, can you think you can have tetany in the heart? No, you can't. This makes tetany impossible. So tetany does not occur in the heart. You can't re-stimulate it to contract until it has relaxed. It has to relax between contractions. So if we come down here and write this out, skeletal only, the muscle contracts and relaxes after refractory. This means you can re-stimulate before it relaxes. So this allows you to achieve tetany, which just is a sustained contraction. And think about like the planking challenges. Like they say you're in good shape if you can plank for 2 minutes. You're keeping your muscles contracted for 2 minutes in a plank. So you're doing tetany. You're re-stimulating those muscles before they have a chance to relax. In your heart, you have that plateau, stretches out the refractory. So because the plateau is stretching out the refractory, the muscle has time to relax before it can be re-stimulated. That means you cannot sustain a contraction. It must relax between contractions. This is important because it's during that relaxation that the heart fills with blood. Remember, the heart is a pump, so it has to fill with blood, then contract and pump the blood out. It fills with blood while it's relaxed. So you need this plateau in order to give you a long refractory so that you are forced to allow the heart to relax and fill with blood in order to contract and pump the blood. If you didn't have that long refractory and you could have tetany in the heart, it would seize up. It would contract and then just stay contracted, and you wouldn't actually be pumping blood. You'd just be sitting there frozen in this contraction and not refilling and pumping the blood. So the plateau gives you a long refractory, which means that you are forced to relax between contractions, which means you have a chance to refill. That's the significance of having the calcium coming in addition to making extra cross bridges. The calcium also provides the plateau. So this extracellular calcium that comes into your cardiac muscle does two things. It allows you to make more cross bridges for more force. And it provides the plateau, which then provides the long refractory, which is what ensures that your heart relaxes to refill.